The desert wind carried the smell of burning oil and scorched metal. It whistled low across the dunes of Tunisia, twisting up small whirlwinds that danced around the blackened remains of trucks and tanks. The sun, merciless and white, hung like a judgment over the dying remnants of the Afrika Korps. In the distance, a lone German half-track sat abandoned, its tires half melted, its machine gun drooping like a wilted flower. The war in North Africa was ending, not with the thunder of victory, but with the slow hiss of surrender. A young soldier named Karl-Heinz Wöhler knelt beside a destroyed Panzer IV. His lips cracked, his throat raw from days without water. He had been 17 when he'd joined the Wehrmacht, full of ideals, full of Hitler's promises of destiny and greatness. Now he was 21, staring at the empty horizon where he once imagined glory would rise. Instead, he saw only heat mirages and defeat. Behind him, columns of German and Italian soldiers trudged westward, tens of thousands of them, stripped of their weapons, their boots worn thin. British and American soldiers watched warily from jeeps, rifles slung loosely but ready. The victors didn't look triumphant. They looked exhausted. The vanquished didn't look broken. They looked relieved. The radio crackled somewhere, static. Then an American voice, cheerful, almost casual. Orders about prisoners, convoys, camps. Wöhler couldn't understand all the words, but he caught one that would soon change his life forever. Transport to the States. He thought he misheard. The States? The United States? Surely they meant England, or Algeria, or some holding camp near the coast. But no. Within days, the rumor spread like wildfire through the desert camps. The Americans were shipping German prisoners across the Atlantic, all the way to America itself. At first, no one believed it. Germany's propaganda ministry had painted America as a crumbling capitalist mess, a patchwork of unemployed, lazy civilians led by weak politicians and greedy bankers. It was said to be a land of chaos, of jazz and corruption and social decay, unfit for war, incapable of greatness. Surely such a nation could not house prisoners of the Reich. But then came confirmation. Orders filtered down through Allied command. Convoys were being assembled at Oran and Algiers, where captured Axis troops would board troop ships, this time as cargo rather than conquerors, and so began one of the most extraordinary migrations of the Second World War. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war transported across the ocean to a nation most of them had never truly understood. For Karl-Heinz, the journey began at dawn. The guards marched them to the coast in long lines, dusty, ragged, hungry. Allied medics handed out tin cups of water, sometimes a cigarette, sometimes a stale biscuit. The Americans were brisk, efficient, and strangely humane. It confused the Germans. They had been told to expect brutality. Instead, they found order. When they reached the harbor, the sight stole their breath. An American Liberty ship, gray, massive, and impossibly new. Painted numbers gleamed on its hull. Cranes lifted crates of food and ammunition onto the deck. Nearby, destroyers idled, their guns silent but watchful. Karl-Heinz stared at it in silence. The ship was not beautiful. It was industrial, raw, utilitarian. But there were dozens like it, lined up along the coast as far as the eye could see. The sheer scale defied comprehension. Wie viele sind das? One man whispered beside him. How many are there? Karl-Heinz didn't answer. He couldn't. Because that was the moment he began to realize something that every German POW would soon confront. They had been fighting an enemy whose capacity for building, for organizing, for sustaining war was beyond anything Germany could match. The voyage took weeks. Packed below decks, the prisoners slept in hammocks or on wooden planks, eating corned beef and powdered potatoes, guarded but not abused. Some even joked with the Americans. The guards seemed relaxed, young men from Kansas, Ohio, or New York, many barely older than the prisoners themselves. They played cards. They listened to music on small portable radios. One night, Karl-Heinz heard the sound of swing music floating down through the vents, Benny Goodman's clarinet weaving like a ghost across the waves. He lay awake, eyes open in the dark, and thought, so this is the enemy. When the ship finally docked, the morning mist parted to reveal a skyline unlike anything they had ever imagined. New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty stood out first, green and serene, but it was the docks that stole their breath. Cranes, warehouses, freight cars, endless columns of trucks, everything moving in coordinated chaos. Smoke rose from shipyards where men welded new hulls day and night. Trains rolled along parallel tracks, hauling munitions, food, supplies. Overhead aircraft droned in formation, their silver bellies catching the light. Karl-Heinz felt a jolt of disbelief. This was the nation we were told was weak? The American soldiers lined them up for processing. A military band played somewhere nearby, its brass notes echoing across the water. Civilians watched from a distance, some curious, some cold. The POWs expected hostility. They got indifference. America had other things on its mind. The war still raging in Europe and the Pacific. The industrial machine that had to keep churning. The sons and brothers who hadn't come home. The Germans were just another cargo shipment to process. They were loaded onto trains, long chains of black cars that snaked through the American heartland. As the journey began, the POWs pressed their faces to the windows, watching a country unfold before them. Fields of wheat that stretched to the horizon, towns that hummed with activity, factories that spewed smoke like volcanoes. Everywhere they looked, things were working. Machines, people, railroads, all synchronized. In one small town, children waved as the train passed. A few of the Germans waved back. One child held up an American flag, tiny but bright against the blue sky. It was the kind of flag that fluttered from every porch and storefront, stitched into every uniform. The unity stunned them. Germany had propaganda. America had belief. Days later, the train stopped. The air was different, fresh, humid, carrying the smell of pine and earth. They had arrived in the middle of America, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The camp was enormous, barbed wire fences stretching to the tree line, watchtowers spaced at intervals, rows upon rows of wooden barracks. But even here, in what should have been a place of confinement, the prisoners noticed something strange. Organization. The camp had libraries, workshops, even soccer fields. The food was edible. The guards were disciplined but not cruel. There was order, but also an odd sense of respect. Inside one of the barracks, Karl-Heinz sat on his bunk and stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't in danger. It was an unsettling feeling. He thought of the last message he'd heard from German radio before capture, Goebbels declaring that America was collapsing under its own corruption. That it was a nation of mongrels, too soft to fight, too divided to win. Yet here in the heart of it, he saw something entirely different. Abundance, coordination, confidence. The next morning, they were marched to a nearby sawmill, one of many where POWs would work for local industries, earning small wages credited to camp accounts. When Karl-Heinz stepped inside, the roar of machinery nearly knocked him back. Belts whirred, gears turned, saws screamed as they sliced through timber. Dozens of American workers moved in rhythm, like clockwork. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Fritz," he said. "We'll make a worker out of you yet." Karl-Heinz didn't know the words, but he understood the tone. There was no hatred, only work to be done. That night, as the camp lights dimmed and crickets sang in the Mississippi heat, the young German lay awake and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had been taught. Germany, he thought, had the best engineers, the greatest scientists, the most disciplined soldiers. But this system, was something else entirely. It wasn't brilliance. It was scale. It was mass production. He had seen tanks hand-built by craftsmen in German factories. Here he saw America building ships faster than Germany could sink them. He'd been told the Reich was an unstoppable machine, but America was a continent that had turned itself into one. As days became weeks, the POWs began to notice more. Supply trucks that arrived like clockwork, uniforms so plentiful that guards replaced them weekly, newspapers printed in color, radios that played symphonies at night, and every few days they'd hear the distant rumble of trains heading east, carrying more soldiers, more equipment, more steel. One of the older prisoners, a former engineer named Otto Hartmann, said it quietly one evening. If this country truly decides to win, it will. No one can stop this. There was silence afterward. Even the guards seemed to sense it. And then came the day the prisoners were given a tour, not for their benefit, but as part of an agricultural program. They were driven past fields of corn, then into a factory where farm equipment was being produced. Inside, endless rows of assembly lines turned out tractors, plows, and trucks. Women in overalls worked side by side with men, welding, riveting, assembling. Jazz played over loudspeakers. Karl-Heinz could barely process it. These people were not only fighting a war on two fronts, they were feeding themselves, manufacturing at unprecedented speed, and still living as if the world wasn't collapsing. When they returned to camp, he couldn't sleep. The image of those machines, that production, haunted him. He thought of his father back home in Dresden, queuing for bread, ration cards in hand. He thought of the blackout curtains, the rubble, the shortages. And here was a nation that had turned abundance into a weapon. Some nights the guards shared news. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Italy was faltering. Germany was bombing London again, but the British held. American bombers, those endless silver fortresses, were striking deep into the Reich. Karl-Heinz listened, silent. He realized the truth with a slow, sick certainty. The tide had already turned before he'd even boarded the ship, but there was something deeper, more haunting than the fear of defeat. It was the realization that the world he had been taught to despise might actually be better at everything Germany had claimed as its pride. Freedom, it turned out, could be efficient. Democracy, it seemed, could build faster than dictatorship. And the people, ordinary Americans, didn't just work. They believed. That belief powered the furnaces, the forges, the shipyards, the factories. It powered the trains that moved endlessly through the night, carrying the raw might of a continent into war. Karl-Heinz wasn't sure what scared him more, losing the war, or realizing why they were losing it. One evening, a storm rolled across Mississippi. Thunder cracked like artillery. Rain hammered the tin roofs. Inside the barracks, a few prisoners huddled around a small radio the guards sometimes let them listen to. It was tuned to a news broadcast. The announcer's voice was calm, confident, distinctly American. He spoke of production numbers, how many planes rolled off the assembly line that week, how many ships launched from the yards, how many tons of steel poured from the mills. The numbers were staggering, unreal. Then came a brief announcement. Another 50,000 German prisoners expected to arrive by month's end. Karl-Heinz felt his stomach drop. 50,000, just 1 month. It hit him like a physical blow. The Reich was bleeding, and America was absorbing its soldiers like rainwater into an endless river. When the storm ended, he stepped outside. The camp was quiet except for the dripping eaves and the hum of distant generators. The sky cleared slowly, revealing a vast dome of stars. He stared at them for a long time. Somewhere across that ocean of darkness, Germany was burning. Here, the lights never went out. The guards called for lights out, and one by one, the bulbs flickered off. But Karl-Heinz stayed awake, staring into the blackness, listening to the hum of a generator that never seemed to stop. He thought of the Reich's proud claim that it would last 1,000 years. And for the first time he wondered if the real power in this war didn't belong to those who shouted loudest, but to those who simply kept building. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, carrying the faint smell of diesel from a distant highway. Somewhere beyond the fences, America kept moving, machines roaring, furnaces glowing, trains screaming through the night. An empire not of conquest, but of production. An empire that never slept. And in that quiet Mississippi night, a young German prisoner finally understood. The truth that no propaganda could hide. The world he knew was ending. But he had no idea yet, none of them did, that what they were about to witness in the coming months would challenge not just their loyalties, but their entire sense of civilization itself. Because America's power wasn't just industrial. It was human, and that was something far more terrifying to comprehend. The story of America's industrial might did not begin with the war. It began with fear. In the autumn of 1938, before the smoke of Poland, before the fall of France, the United States was still a nation scarred by the Great Depression. Bread lines wound through the streets of Chicago and New York. Dust storms rolled over Kansas. Factories stood silent, their windows boarded up. Men who had once built bridges and railroads now begged for work outside factory gates. And yet, hidden beneath the dust of despair, a sleeping giant waited. The men who would awaken it were already moving quietly through Washington. Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the helm, calm and enigmatic, his cigarette holder tilted upward like a conductor's baton. His voice, when it came over the radio, soothed the fear of millions. He spoke of recovery, of courage, of collective will. "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," he had said once. And though few believed it at first, the words had taken root. By 1940, as the storm of war gathered over Europe, Roosevelt began to look west, across the Atlantic toward nations already burning. Britain was fighting alone. France was gone, Poland erased. And in that moment, Roosevelt saw not only danger, but destiny. He called America the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a challenge to physics itself, to turn idle factories into forges, plowshares into bombers, despair into output. The transformation began with sound, the sudden thunderous return of machinery. The first clangs of wrenches on bolts in Detroit, the shriek of lathes cutting steel in Pittsburgh, the rhythmic pounding of hammers in the shipyards of Newport News and Portland, America was waking up. Factories that had once made refrigerators now churned out machine guns. Typewriter companies retooled for carburetors and shell casings. Auto plants stripped their floors of sedans and replaced them with the assembly lines of war. Henry Ford, whose empire had defined the automobile age, now promised Roosevelt that he would build bombers, one every hour, and he meant it. At Willow Run, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company built a factory so massive it had its own weather. It stretched nearly a mile long, its roof an ocean of corrugated metal. Inside, the workers moved like an orchestra. Tens of thousands of men and women welding, riveting, assembling. The result? The B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that became the embodiment of America's reach. At its height, Willow Run produced one bomber every 55 minutes. The statistics were staggering. But behind every number was a human face. Farmers turned machinists. Teachers turned riveters. Housewives turned engineers. Women poured into the workforce, their hair tied in bandanas, their hands black with oil. They called her Rosie the Riveter, but she was millions of women, from every corner of the country, answering the call. The War Production Board, established in 1942, became the conductor of this symphony. Chaired by Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive, it coordinated the impossible. Who would make what, how much, and how fast. Civilian industries were drafted into service. Aluminum pans were melted into aircraft parts. Silk stockings disappeared from stores, their material diverted to parachutes. Even children collected scrap metal, dragging wagon loads of rusted iron to neighborhood depots. It wasn't just mobilization. It was reinvention. In just 4 years, the United States would outproduce every Axis nation combined. But in 1940, no one could yet see that far. All they saw was an untested promise, a nation preparing for a war it hadn't yet entered. Across the ocean. In Berlin, the news was met with contempt. Hitler laughed at Roosevelt's speeches. Goebbels scoffed at the machine-age cowboys who believed they could outproduce the Reich. "Americans," he sneered, "are businessmen, not soldiers. They will build and they will sell, but they will not fight." And in some sense, he was right, at least for the moment. America was not yet fighting. It was building, and oh, how it built. Steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, food. Each became a weapon in itself. In Pittsburgh, furnaces glowed day and night, pouring out rivers of molten steel. In Louisiana, refineries belched smoke as oil pipelines stretched toward the coasts. In Kansas, wheat harvests fed not only Americans but allies across the sea. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. The day that turned a reluctant nation into a roaring engine. Within hours of the attack, enlistment lines snaked around city blocks. But for every man who donned a uniform, 10 more picked up tools. The assembly line became a front line. The factory floor, a battlefield. Roosevelt's fireside chats changed tone. They were no longer appeals to hope. They were calls to arms. This nation, he declared, must become the great arsenal of democracy. And it did. Within a single year, the United States doubled its industrial output. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a Liberty ship every 3 days. Each one was a floating miracle of efficiency. A cargo ship that could be built faster than the Germans could sink it. Henry J. Kaiser, the shipbuilder who had once worked on dams, became a legend. His yards in Richmond, California ran 24 hours a day, floodlit like stadiums. Workers punched in by the thousands, building ships in assembly line fashion, modular pieces fitted together like a child's toy. The record? 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel to launch. When Kaiser's wife christened one with a champagne bottle, she quipped, "We'd better not blink, or it'll be in the Pacific before we finish the toast." And in a way, she was right. These ships carried everything. Tanks, jeeps, munitions, and eventually prisoners of war. It was on these very vessels that men like Karl-Heinz Wöhler crossed the Atlantic, eyes wide with disbelief as they saw what America could build, not in years, but in weeks. In the halls of Berlin, reports filtered in from U-boat commanders. They could not keep up. For every ship they sank, 5 more appeared. "It is like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon," one captain wrote in despair. And still the factories thundered on. Detroit alone produced more war material than all of Italy. American aircraft factories rolled out nearly 300,000 planes during the war. The United States built 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 6 million rifles. But to understand the shock of the German POWs, one must understand what this meant psychologically. Germany's industry was powerful, but precise, a surgeon's hand. America's was overwhelming, a tidal wave. Where the Germans built perfection, the Americans built plenty. German tanks were engineering marvels, but expensive, slow to produce, and maintenance nightmares. American Shermans were simpler, cheaper, and everywhere. Quantity became its own quality. This was what men like Karl-Heinz would witness firsthand, the quiet, unstoppable rhythm of a nation that treated war as another industrial process. But beyond the machines, there was something subtler. In the cities, the war effort transformed daily life. Children gathered scrap. Housewives planted victory gardens. Movie theaters sold war bonds between reels. Baseball players enlisted. Even cartoon characters joined the cause. Donald Duck paying taxes. Bugs Bunny mocking the Axis. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also participation. The entire nation felt enlisted. In Chicago, the Pullman Company produced sleeping cars by day and tank turrets by night. In Baltimore, women stitched parachutes under the glow of factory lamps. In Seattle, Boeing engineers tested bombers whose wings spanned entire streets. It was as if the country itself had become a living organism. Every limb, every heartbeat synchronized toward a single purpose, victory. And all the while, across the ocean, Germany was starving. The Allied blockade choked supplies. Bombing raids leveled factories. Coal ran short. Fuel was precious. The Wehrmacht's machines, once unstoppable, began to falter not from lack of courage, but lack of resources. And yet, German propaganda persisted, insisting that America was soft, that its people were weak. Its spirit divided. But the POWs who would later work in America saw the lie unravel. They saw men who worked 12-hour shifts, women who juggled factory work and motherhood, communities that pooled money to build bombers. One POW in Texas wrote secretly in his diary, "They have everything. Not just machines, but energy. It is as if the entire land hums with electricity. We were told they were lazy. They are not. They are limitless. The transformation of America wasn't only physical, it was cultural. In the South, Black Americans fought for the right to serve fully. The WWII campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, gave rise to early sparks of the civil rights movement. In the West, Japanese Americans were interned, their loyalty questioned even as their sons fought bravely in Europe. The contradiction was painful, yet the war forced the nation to confront its own reflection. Roosevelt knew it. "We must be the great example," he said privately. "For if we fight tyranny abroad, we must not harbor it within." And still, the assembly lines roared. By 1943, unemployment had dropped to less than 2%, effectively zero. Women comprised 1/3 of the workforce. The nation that had crawled through the Depression was now the most productive society in human history. German intelligence reports were frantic. Abwehr agents sent coded messages back to Berlin, describing the vastness of American industry. Their potential is infinite, one report concluded. We are facing an enemy whose resources defy imagination. Even Hitler in his bunker admitted privately to Speer, his armaments minister, that Germany could never match it. They have factories, he said bitterly. We have ruins. But the most remarkable part of this story was invisible. For all the production, the propaganda, the sheer scale, America had done something miraculous. It had made its people believe that sacrifice was strength, that rationing was patriotic, that hard work was victory, sugar, rubber, meat, all rationed. Gasoline was scarce. But rather than rebellion, there was pride. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a creed. This sense of unity, messy, imperfect, but real, was what the POWs would feel most acutely when they stepped onto American soil. Because in Germany, obedience was demanded. In America, participation was offered. And somehow, that made all the difference. By the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa was reaching its end. The Allied armies under Eisenhower and Montgomery closed the noose around the German Afrika Korps, commanded by General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim after Rommel's departure. Trapped between the sea and the sands, outnumbered, outgunned, and starved of fuel, the last Axis soldiers surrendered in May. More than 250,000 men laid down their arms. For the Allies, it was a logistical nightmare. What to do with 250,000 prisoners? For America, it was an opportunity. The decision was made quickly. Send them to the United States. There, they would work, not as slaves, but as laborers. Their wages credited per Geneva Convention rules. The aim was simple: relieve the manpower shortage at home while keeping the prisoners secure. Ships were readied, convoys assembled, camps built. The machine of war expanded yet again, this time to absorb even its enemies. And so, as Chapter 1 unfolded, with Karl-Heinz and thousands like him crossing the Atlantic, the machine was already waiting. They would be processed, catalogued, distributed. Some to Texas, some to Louisiana, some to the farmlands of Iowa and Nebraska. Everywhere they went, they would find the same thing, an America that didn't merely talk about victory, it manufactured it. One POW officer later recalled, "We saw their trains, their trucks, their machines, and we realized this country is a continent that has turned itself into a single army." By the time Karl-Heinz arrived at Camp Shelby, that army had reached full stride. The furnaces glowed without pause. The cranes at the shipyards never stopped moving. The smoke of war rose not from destruction, but creation. And in that relentless hum, the Germans began to sense a truth that chilled them more than any weapon. They had been told that ideology could win wars, but standing in the heart of America, they realized something far more dangerous. Production was ideology. Because in this nation, production meant faith. Faith in democracy, in effort, in unity. A faith that did not require permission from a Führer or fear of a Gestapo. It was self-propelled, and that made it unstoppable. The POWs would soon see the full extent of it, how this power not only built weapons, but transformed lives, landscapes, and even hearts. But first, they would have to confront their own illusions. For as they began working alongside Americans, they would learn that the true shock was not how powerful America was, but how human it was. Long before they saw America, the men of the Afrika Korps saw Germany, or rather, what they were told was Germany. In the spring of 1941, when Karl-Heinz Wöhler first stood in formation in Hanover, the air itself seemed filled with certainty. The drums of the Hitlerjugend echoed through the streets. Flags rippled from every balcony, red and black and white, so thick that you could not see the bricks beneath them. The speeches blared from loudspeakers, filling every silence with confidence, with destiny. Germany, they were told, was not merely a nation. It was a rebirth, a phoenix risen from humiliation. The faces around him, young, sharp, proud, carried the same expression: belief. Belief that their leader had restored order where chaos had once ruled. That the world trembled because Germany had found its will again. Karl-Heinz had believed it too. His father had spoken bitterly of 1918, the hunger, the defeat, the stab in the back. His mother had whispered about Versailles like a curse. But Hitler had promised to undo all of it, and for a time it seemed he had. By 1939, the newspapers glowed with triumphs. Poland fallen in weeks, Norway in days, France crushed in a month. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, an army of precision, discipline and destiny. Even the enemies believed it, at least for a while. And then came the desert, the sun-bleached frontier of empire where myth met reality. When Rommel arrived in North Africa in 1941, he brought with him the aura of a modern Alexander. The desert fox, his armored spearheads cut across Libya and Egypt like lightning, outnumbered yet unstoppable. The British fled. The headlines in Berlin declared it divine proof. German genius would triumph anywhere. But behind the headlines, the truth was less poetic. The Africa Corps was short on fuel, short on food, and sustained by willpower more than logistics. Its supply lines stretched like spider silk across the Mediterranean, fragile and exposed. Rommel himself warned Berlin that victory required ships, not speeches. But in the marble halls of the Reich Chancellery, the warnings were dismissed. Confidence had hardened into arrogance. For the men in the field, though, faith remained unshaken. When Karl-Heinz first saw a Panzer III crest a dune, the sun glinting off its turret, he felt he was seeing the embodiment of German order, a machine of purpose in a world of chaos. They sang as they advanced. They joked as they fought. They believed that even the desert itself respected them, and why wouldn't they? Everywhere they went, the swastika rose, the enemy retreated, and the Führer's voice on the radio promised victory after victory. But the Americans were a mystery. They were a country of movies and music, of chewing gum and jazz. Goebbels painted them as mongrels, a people of immigrants, of no culture, no discipline. The American soldier, he sneered, is a slave to the machine. He fights for dollars, not for ideals. The propaganda reels reinforce the myth. Cartoonish images of fat, lazy GIs eating chocolate bars while real men, Germans, fought for honor. The cinema made it gospel. Karl-Heinz remembered the film he saw in 1942, shown in a smoky barracks in Tripoli. It depicted an American factory as chaos. Workers drunk, women idle, machines falling apart. The audience laughed, clapped, believed. Belief, after all, was easier than doubt. But then came the turning. First, the British refused to die. Then the Americans landed in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, November 1942. At first, the Germans scoffed. Amateurs, they said. They'll collapse in days, but they didn't. In fact, the Americans arrived with something terrifying: organization. Within weeks, docks were built, airstrips paved, supply lines humming. The Yanks learned fast, too fast. Their tanks weren't elegant, but there were many. Their planes weren't graceful, but they came in swarms. At Kasserine Pass, Karl-Heinz and his comrades fought them for the first time. The Americans broke, then came back stronger. Within 2 months, their artillery was coordinated, their logistics efficient, their commanders learning from every mistake. For the first time, the Germans felt the ground shifting beneath them. It wasn't just the soldiers they were fighting. It was a system. Rommel saw it too. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "The Americans are like a steamroller. Slow to start, but once moving, impossible to stop." By early 1943, the desert victories were memories. The Africa Corps was cornered, the supplies gone, the air dominated by Allied bombers that seemed endless. Karl-Heinz still remembered the night sky, filled not with stars, but with the white blossoms of flares descending over the dunes. The air smelled of diesel and despair. When the surrender came, it wasn't a shock. It was relief, and yet even in defeat they held on to pride. Captivity was temporary, they told themselves. Germany would rally. The Führer had new weapons, secret plans, vengeance brewing. They would return home victorious. That's what they believed, until the ship sailed west. On the deck, days later, as the coastline of Africa sank into the horizon, the young soldiers stared eastward. Some wept quietly, some sang. Some simply stared at the empty sea. Their officers told them they were being taken to Britain or Canada. But when the captain's announcement came, destination, United States of America, the deck fell silent. It wasn't fear they felt. It was curiosity. What did America look like? The land of jazz and skyscrapers? The enemy of the Reich's imagination. They joked nervously. Perhaps we will be put to work in Wall Street counting their dollars, one man said. Or maybe we will fix their refrigerators. No one laughed. When they finally saw the Statue of Liberty, they expected ruin, rust, decay, poverty. Instead, they saw cranes, smokestacks, locomotives, movement. Everywhere, movement. The myth cracked. In Berlin, Goebbels' ministry refused to acknowledge this. Reports from returning officers, those few exchanged before the war's end, were censored. The official line was unchanged. America was collapsing under its own greed. But inside the camps, across Texas, Iowa, and Mississippi, a different story spread quietly from man to man. The rumor that America was functioning, thriving. The rumor that prisoners were eating better than civilians in Germany, that the guards were friendly, that the factories were infinite. The Reich tried to suppress these whispers. Lügen, lies, the propaganda leaflets shouted. But letters sent home, censored though they were, carried hints. We are treated fairly, they wrote. There is much to see here. The people are strange but not cruel. The censors let the lines pass. They didn't see the danger in them. But belief is a fragile thing. And the moment a soldier begins to doubt the righteousness of his cause, the war inside him begins long before the war outside ends. For men like Karl Heinz, that war began in America, not on the battlefield, but in the silence between hammer blows on a factory floor. He met a man named Thomas, a sawmill worker with grease on his hands and a grin like sunlight. Thomas had 2 brothers in the Pacific, another in Italy. Yet he spoke with no hatred. You and me, Fritz, he said once. We're just men stuck in a storm neither of us started. It was the first time Karl Heinz heard an American speak without contempt. He didn't know how to respond. For years, he had been told that Americans were mongrels, weak, decadent. But this man worked 12 hours a day, then went home to tend a small farm. His wife volunteered at a Red Cross station. His children recited the Pledge of Allegiance with pride. Weak? Hardly. The POWs began to see it everywhere, in the faces of farmers who repaired their own machinery, in the confidence of women running factories, in the endless rhythm of supply trains rolling past the camps at night, and as the months passed, news trickled in. Sicily fallen, Mussolini overthrown, Italy out of the war, the Allies advancing through Europe. Each bulletin chipped away at the myth of invincibility, but it was the letters that broke it. In late 1943, new POWs arrived, captured in Sicily, in Italy, in France. They brought stories. Berlin bombed nightly, Hamburg in ashes, Dresden trembling, fuel scarce, bread rationed, and worst of all, whispers that the Führer's voice had changed, not thunderous, but frantic. The old certainties withered. Some clung harder to belief. Others let it die quietly. One evening, around a campfire inside the wire, an older officer named Hauptmann Weiss spoke softly. They told us we were the master race, he said. But tell me, which race builds like this? Which race feeds its prisoners while it fights a world war? No one answered, because everyone already knew. They had seen it. They had felt it. In the hum of power plants. In the endless convoys. In the generosity of a farmer who gave them apples through the fence. Smiling, as if the war were a passing storm. And that was what frightened them most, because strength wrapped in cruelty could be dismissed as barbarism. But strength wrapped in decency, that was something else entirely. That was a kind of power Germany had never known. Karl Heinz began writing in a small notebook hidden under his mattress. His entries were short, almost confessional. "America does not fear," he wrote. "It simply continues. Like a river that flows around stones. The more he saw, the more he doubted. Was this the enemy? Or was this what Germany could have been if it had chosen differently?" Some nights he dreamed of Berlin, the parades, the banners, the music. In those dreams, the colors seemed garish now, the speeches hollow. In the distance, he could hear not drums but factory hammers, and he would wake, sweating, unsure which world was real. Around that time, the American newspapers began reporting on the bombing of Berlin. Some guards shared the headlines, proud but not gloating. "We're getting closer," they said. Karl-Heinz read the words and felt nothing but dread. His parents were there, his friends. Everything he'd known was now under siege. Yet even in that fear, he could not deny the awe he felt. America's reach, across oceans, across continents, was inhuman in scale, and still, the guards joked, shared cigarettes, and handed out newspapers when done. The contradiction tore at him. He wanted to hate them, but hatred no longer fit. One afternoon, while hauling lumber near the camp fence, he saw a convoy rumble by on the highway, endless trucks loaded with crates stamped with stenciled letters. U.S. Army, munitions for Europe. The line of vehicles seemed to have no end. He counted until he lost count. When the last truck vanished beyond the horizon, he turned to Thomas, the foreman, who was leaning on his shovel. "Whistling a tune, how do you do it?" Karl-Heinz asked, his English broken but clear. Thomas shrugged. "Same way we do everything," he said. "One day at a time." Altogether, it sounded simple. But in that simplicity lay the secret. The Americans didn't need ideology. They had momentum. And for a man raised in a nation where every thought, every gesture, every heartbeat was supposed to serve a single ideology, that realization was shattering. In the quiet of his bunk that night, Karl-Heinz wrote one final line in his notebook before the guards turned out the lights. "They told us that freedom makes men weak." They were wrong. Outside, the night hummed with the distant echo of trains, the sound of a continent in motion, carrying the instruments of its own victory. Inside the barracks, one by one the POWs fell silent, not in sleep, but in thought. They could feel it now in their bones. The world they had believed in was crumbling, and something vast and unstoppable was taking its place. And as dawn began to glow faintly through the slats of the barracks, Karl-Heinz realized with a chill that this new world, the one born of factories, freedom and faith, might not need conquerors at all. It was conquering by existing. The first time Karl-Heinz heard the word Normandy, it came not from a German radio, but from an American Guards newspaper. It was June 6, 1944. The dawn at Camp Shelby broke damp and heavy, thunderclouds hanging over the pine forests like dark sails. In the mess hall, the guards huddled around a crackling radio, its voice urgent, clipped, relentless. The words drifted through the room in English the prisoners half understood. Invasion. France, beaches, Allied landings. At first disbelief, then murmurs, then silence so complete that even the clatter of spoons against tin trays ceased. The guards looked up, faces pale with awe and exhaustion. One of them muttered, "It's begun." For the German prisoners, it was as though the earth itself had tilted. The invasion they had feared, the one the Reich had promised would never come, was underway. Der Tag, the day, long prophesied, long denied. Karl-Heinz felt his pulse in his throat. He could see it in his mind, the gray coast, the rising tide, the thunder of artillery. He could almost smell the cordite, the wet sand, the sea mixed with smoke. Somewhere out there, young men not unlike him were storming into history. He wasn't there to fight, yet he felt every heartbeat of the battle. The guards didn't gloat. They were solemn, almost reverent. They knew the cost that morning demanded. The radio spoke of thousands landing under fire, of ships burning, of sky-darkening aircraft formations. To Karl-Heinz, the numbers were incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands. Such scale belonged to industry, not to war. But that was America's genius, to make them the same thing. That night, the guards pinned a newspaper clipping to the mess hall wall. Allied armies storm French coast. Beneath it, a photograph, rows of landing crafts surging through waves like an iron tide. The prisoners stared at it for hours. For some, pride curdled into despair. For others, into defiance. And for Karl-Heinz, into wonder. So this is how an empire moves, he thought. Not with parades, but with production. Across the Atlantic, the real thunder rolled. The beaches of Normandy erupted under the heaviest naval bombardment in human history. Over 5,000 ships formed the Armada. The sea boiled with gunfire, the air screamed with aircraft engines. The earth itself seemed to tremble. On Omaha Beach, young Americans, farm boys from Iowa, clerks from Boston, miners from Kentucky, charged into surf turned red. They clawed their way up sand and steel, through chaos that defied sanity. And behind them, somewhere far beyond sight, stretched the unbroken chain of supply, the factories, the trains, the shipyards, the mothers who had packed their lunches with trembling hands. This was the true might that the German POWs would never see directly, but would feel in every ration, every rumor, every heartbeat, the industrial heart that pumped iron and courage into every soldier crossing those waves. In Germany, the sky was no longer blue. It was aluminum. Allied bombers filled it by the hundreds, sometimes thousands. The citizens of Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne watched daylight vanish behind silver wings. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, stared at production charts and knew the numbers lied. Every factory rebuilt was destroyed again within weeks. Rail lines twisted, fuel depots vanished, cities burned. Yet still he reported progress to Hitler, because truth had become treason. The Reich fought the way a drowning man fights the sea, thrashing, furious, doomed. Back in America, the prisoners watched trains roll east day after day, each one heavier, longer, faster. Each whistle a reminder that somewhere, on another continent, the world was ending. Sometimes, as the POWs worked the fields, American planes thundered overhead, C-47s and B-17s, their engines like heartbeats of the sky. The prisoners stopped and stared until the noise faded. None of them spoke. The guards didn't either, because by now, everyone knew. The war's outcome was no longer a question of if, only of when. That summer, Camp Shelby swelled with new arrivals, men from Italy, from France. From shattered divisions once proud and now skeletal, they brought stories of retreat, of cities in ruins, of generals arguing in bunkers while soldiers starved in trenches that no longer mattered. They spoke of Hitler's rage, of orders that made no sense, of executions for cowardice, of faith crumbling under the weight of reality. The prisoners who had arrived in 1943 looked at these new men with pity. They themselves had once been believers. Now they were witnesses. One evening, as the Mississippi twilight turned the sky purple, a transport truck pulled into the camp carrying a new batch of captives. Among them was a major named Dieter von Schmidt, a veteran of the Eastern Front. He was tall, severe, his uniform threadbare but immaculate, his eyes cold as iron. During dinner, he surveyed the camp and sneered. "So," he said, "this is the enemy's paradise. Fat Americans feeding their prisoners while our children starve." No one answered. He slammed his tin cup down. "You've forgotten who you are. You sit here like cattle while the fatherland bleeds." Karl-Heinz looked up. "And what would you have us do, Herr Major? Swim home?" The barracks went still. Von Schmidt's glare could have cut steel, but after a moment he turned away. The silence that followed was heavy, not with fear but with fatigue. Even the officers were running out of anger. By autumn, news of Paris's liberation reached the camp. The guards celebrated quietly, respectful even in victory. The prisoners read the headlines, their eyes tracing every line as if reading their own eulogies. Paris, the jewel of Europe, free again. The myth of Nazi permanence shattered like glass. That night, thunderstorms rolled over Mississippi, lightning flashing behind the pines. Karl-Heinz lay awake listening to the rain drumming on the roof, imagining the same rain falling on the ruins of Europe. He pictured his mother in Dresden, lighting a candle when the power failed, listening for sirens. He wondered if she still believed the things she'd taught him to chant as a boy. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader. The words sounded empty now, like an echo from another life. Inside the camp, small rebellions of thought began to spread. The POWs formed discussion circles, reading whatever newspapers or magazines they could find. Some secretly learned English. Others began to debate politics, carefully, quietly, but with growing boldness. They discovered that even behind barbed wire, ideas could be free. The American officers noticed and, surprisingly, encouraged it. They organized educational programs under the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, classes in history, democracy, economics. The goal was not re-education by force, but by exposure, to show these men a world without dictatorship, to let them see ideas as tools, not chains. Karl-Heinz enrolled out of curiosity. His instructor was a professor from the University of Mississippi, a man with kind eyes and tobacco-stained fingers. He began the first class with a simple question. What is freedom? The Germans exchanged wary glances. Von Schmidt scoffed. Freedom is chaos, he said. Discipline builds nations, the professor smiled faintly. Discipline builds armies, he said. Freedom builds civilizations. The room went quiet. Somewhere outside, a train whistle blew, long and low, the sound of industry echoing even here. Karl-Heinz felt something shift inside him. Meanwhile, the war outside their fences reached fever pitch. The Ardennes, December 1944. Snow, fog, and fury. Hitler's last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge roared through the forests of Belgium. Panzer divisions lunged west in a desperate attempt to split the Allied line. For a brief, terrible moment it worked. American units were cut off, frozen, fighting blind in the snow. German tanks rolled once more with the old confidence, their iron treads carving through villages. Back in Mississippi, the POWs listened to reports on the camp radio. For the first time in months, German spirits flickered alive. "We're not finished yet," some shouted. "The Führer still has strength." But the flame was short. Within weeks, Allied counterattacks smashed the offensive. Fuel ran out. The panzers burned where they stopped. The fog lifted, and with it, the last illusion of victory. When the news reached Camp Shelby, German forces in retreat, no one cheered, not even the gods. It felt like the closing of a chapter written in blood. The following spring, America's industrial miracle reached its crescendo. In April 1945, Detroit hit its peak. 1 B-24 bomber an hour, 1 tank every 20 minutes, 1 jeep every 5 minutes. The railways ran like veins across a continent. The docks at New York and San Francisco glowed all night with sparks from welding torches. Factories that had once echoed with the clang of war were already planning for peace. Washing machines, tractors, automobiles waiting to reclaim the same assembly lines. The sheer momentum was staggering. War had become the nation's heartbeat. Stopping it would require care. For Germany, there was no such problem. The heartbeat was gone. In the first week of April, rumors reached the camp. Berlin surrounded. Then another, Hitler dead. The guards said nothing at first, but newspapers confirmed it days later. The headline was almost unbelievable in its simplicity. Hitler reported dead in Berlin bunker. The prisoners gathered around the notice board in silence. No cheers, no gasps, just the sound of rain hitting the tin roof. After years of worship, of shouting his name, of marching to his portrait, the moment of his death landed not like thunder, but like dust. One man whispered, "So that's it then." Another crossed himself. Karl-Heinz stared at the paper until the letters blurred. For a long time he felt nothing. Then, slowly, a strange calm, like the stillness after a storm that had raged so long one forgot what quiet sounded like. The war ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. In America, bells rang, flags waved, cities erupted in celebration. Factories blew their whistles not for shifts but for peace. Couples kissed in the streets. Fireworks bloomed over rivers and skylines. Inside the POW camps, the mood was different, solemn, uncertain. Some wept quietly for families they might never see again. Others simply sat, staring at the ground, as though waiting for instructions that would never come. Karl-Heinz wrote one line in his notebook that night. "The war is over, but something inside us is still fighting." Because what ended that day was not only a conflict of armies, but a collision of worlds, of ideologies, of cultures, of faiths in how humans should live. And that battle, he realized, would not be won by surrender. It would be won by understanding. Weeks passed. The camp changed. Barbed wire seemed less sharp, guards more relaxed. POWs were allowed to work farther afield, even socialize with townspeople under supervision. Some played soccer with local boys. Others repaired barns, painted fences, harvested crops. One day, Karl-Heinz helped fix a farmer's tractor. The machine fascinated him, simple, sturdy, efficient. The farmer handed him a wrench and said, "You break it, you fix it." The humor was friendly, not cruel. Karl-Heinz laughed for the first time in years. When the tractor sputtered to life, the farmer grinned. "See, you Germans build 'em good. We just build more of 'em." It was a joke, but it was also the truth. America had won the war not by perfection, but by plenty. By turning production into power, optimism into policy, freedom into fuel, and yet, even victory carried shadows. Across the Pacific, the fire still burned. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The same factories that built Europe's salvation now fed the inferno of Japan. The prisoners read of it with weary detachment. They had seen enough of what men could do when they believed too much. Then, in August, came the unimaginable. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, two cities erased by weapons born of science and secrecy. The guards didn't talk about it much. The newspapers did. The POWs read the words atomic bomb and felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather. If America's industrial might had stunned them, this mastery of the atom, terrified them. It was as if mankind had crossed a threshold and left its own shadow behind. Karl-Heinz wrote, "Perhaps the war is not over. Perhaps it has only changed shape." That autumn, the first POWs began returning home. Trains carried them north-east across the ocean. Each departure was quiet, a handshake, a nod, sometimes a gift from a guard. They left behind bunk beds, notebooks, friendships they never expected to form. When Karl-Heinz's turn came, he looked out from the train window at the landscape rolling past, the fields, the factories, the billboards advertising products already returning to civilian life. The same hands that had built bombers were now building hope. He realized that America's greatest weapon wasn't its machines. It was its ability to change purpose without losing. Momentum, the country that had, conquered by creation, could just as easily build peace as it had built war. He wondered if Germany would ever learn to do the same. As the train approached the port of embarkation, he saw one last sight he would never forget, a shipyard alive with sparks, new vessels rising even in peacetime, cranes swinging like the arms of gods. The war was over, yet the work continued, proof that America's engine didn't run on fear, but on faith. And for the first time, Karl-Heinz felt something that surprised him. Admiration. Not for the power, but for the perseverance. He closed his notebook and thought of the professor's question months earlier. What is freedom? He still didn't have a full answer, but he knew it sounded like the hum of factories at night. Like laughter in the midst of loss. Like a nation that could fight without hate and build without pause. Outside, the ocean waited, gray and infinite. Home lay somewhere beyond it, whatever home meant now. He rested his head against the glass as the train slowed, the whistle echoing across the docks. Behind him, America roared softly on, endless and alive. And as the guards called his name, he stepped forward, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a notebook filled with questions. Questions that would haunt him, and his generation, for the rest of their lives. Because if America had taught him anything, it was that victory was not the end of a battle. It was the beginning of understanding what the battle had meant. The Atlantic was quiet that summer, unnervingly quiet. The kind of calm that follows a storm so vast, it leaves the sea unsure how to breathe again. On the deck of the troop ship bound for Europe, Karl-Heinz Wöhler stood alone against the railing, watching gulls wheel above the gray water. He was thinner now, harder, his face carved by years of sun and labor. The salt wind burned his eyes, but he didn't blink. Somewhere beyond that horizon, lay the ruins of the world that had once defined him. Behind him, men murmured in low voices, other prisoners, returning to what was left of home. Some spoke eagerly, dreaming of wives and children, of beer and bread. Others said nothing. Most didn't know what they would find. None knew what they would feel. The ship moved steadily eastward, its engines thrumming like a slow heartbeat. Occasionally, an officer would stride by, clipboard in hand, reminding them that they were still not free men, merely repatriated ones. The war was over, yes, but the consequences weren't. Karl-Heinz leaned on the rail and looked down at his reflection in the rolling black water. He barely recognized himself. The boy who had boarded a troop ship in 1941 had carried a rifle and a head full of certainty. The man who returned in 1946 carried only questions. What did it mean to be German now? To belong to a nation that had waged destruction on such scale that the very word civilization seemed smaller afterward. No one had an answer, but he knew this. Somewhere in the ashes, the reckoning had begun. The ship docked at Bremerhaven on a gray morning. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and the skyline, what was left of it, looked like broken teeth. The once proud port was a skeleton, cranes twisted, warehouses gutted, streets pitted with bomb craters. The silence was eerie. Even the seagulls seemed hesitant to cry. When the gangway dropped, the returning POWs filed down one by one. No band waited to greet them. No flags waved. Only a few Red Cross workers in faded uniforms. Faces tired from years of tending the wounded of both body and soul. A soldier near Karl-Heinz whispered, "It's like coming home to a graveyard." He wasn't wrong. The road inland was a journey through desolation. Cities that had once glowed with promise were now wastelands. Cologne, flattened. Hamburg, charred. Kassel, gone. The train rolled through mile after mile of ruin, past blackened forests and villages of rubble. Children scavenged near the tracks, waving weakly for food. Some of the POWs tossed them rations through the windows. The children caught them like miracles. When the train reached Dresden, Karl-Heinz stepped off and stood motionless. There was no city, only absence. The skyline he remembered, the domes and spires of his youth, were piles of brick. The streets where he'd walked to school were buried under mountains of ash. He walked for hours in silence, past the Frauenkirche's collapsed dome, past the Elbe shimmering with the reflections of nothing. It was as though the city had been erased, and with it, the illusions of everything he'd once believed indestructible. His parents' house was gone. He found only the foundation, half swallowed by weeds. A neighbor told him his mother had died in February of '45 during the firebombing. She had refused to go to the shelters, saying she would not abandon her home. The firestorm left no trace of her. His father had died a few months later. Pneumonia, they said, though everyone knew it was grief. Karl-Heinz stood among the ruins until night fell, the wind whistling through broken chimneys. He whispered her name into the silence and received nothing but the echo of a world that no longer existed. That was when he began to understand the full cost of what they had fought for. Not the loss of territory or power, but the annihilation of meaning. Germany had been emptied not only of life, but of belief. Across the country, millions of soldiers returned to the same revelation. The Reich was gone, its leaders dead or awaiting trial. The swastikas had been torn down, replaced by flags that felt foreign even to the victors. The Allied occupation zones divided the country like surgical scars. And everywhere, hunger, cold, silence. The post-war winter of 1946 was merciless. The rivers froze, the coal ran out, and entire families lived in cellars and ruins. Men traded cigarettes for bread. Women sold heirlooms for potatoes. Children scavenged in the rubble, barefoot, wide-eyed. Germany had become a nation of ghosts. And yet, amid the despair, something fragile began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but awareness. In the villages near the camps, former POWs were assigned to rebuild. They shoveled bricks, cleared streets, repaired roofs. It was penance and necessity at once. But the hardest rebuilding was internal, in the mind. Because everywhere they went, the truth followed. The concentration camps. At first, the news sounded impossible. American and British newspapers had published photos, but most Germans dismissed them as forgeries, Allied propaganda. But then came witnesses, liberated prisoners. Then came the tours, Allied officers forcing civilians to walk through the camps themselves. Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The images spread like contagion. Skeletal bodies, piles of shoes, ash that had once been human. Karl-Heinz saw the photos in a tattered newspaper passed from hand to hand on a cold afternoon. He sat on a pile of bricks and stared at them until his stomach turned. He wanted to deny it, every instinct screamed to. But denial was a luxury the rubble no longer allowed. A fellow former POW muttered, "Lies. It must be lies." But another older man shook his head. "No, we built the trains." We looked away. "We are all guilty." The words hung in the air like smoke. For the first time, Karl-Heinz understood that the war he had fought had never truly been about borders or ideologies. It had been about blindness, the deliberate, chosen blindness of millions who believed obedience could absolve them of conscience. And that realization was its own kind of battlefield. That winter, he took work clearing rail lines near Leipzig. One morning, an American officer overseeing reconstruction stopped to speak with him. The man was middle-aged, polite, efficient, the kind of quiet authority Karl-Heinz had come to associate with Americans. He handed Karl-Heinz a thermos of coffee, steaming in the frozen air. "You fought in Africa?" the officer asked. "Yes," Karl-Heinz said cautiously. The man nodded. "I was at Normandy." Hell of a mess. They stood there for a while, saying nothing. Steam rose from their cups, merging with the pale winter fog. Finally, the officer said, "We had to build Europe back up." "You'll see. It'll be better this time." Karl-Heinz frowned. "Why help us? After everything?" The American smiled faintly. "Because if we don't, this will all happen again." He walked away, leaving Karl-Heinz staring after him, his breath clouding in the air. That was the moment it struck him. America wasn't rebuilding Europe for profit or pride. It was rebuilding it to prevent despair, because despair, left unattended, becomes hatred, and hatred had already consumed a generation. As 1947 dawned, the Marshall Plan was announced. Billions of dollars in aid began to flow from the very nation the Germans had once been taught to despise. Food, machines, raw materials, not as charity, but as partnership. In the ruins of a Dresden factory, Karl-Heinz watched as American technicians arrived to help restore the power lines. They worked side by side with German laborers, swapping tools and jokes. The irony was almost unbearable. The victors teaching the vanquished how to build again. But in that irony lay redemption. The same industrial power that had once terrified him was now the force that offered him a future. One evening, he returned to what had once been his mother's street. He sat among the rubble with his notebook, the same one he'd carried through Mississippi. He flipped through the pages, the entries written in anger, awe, disbelief, and found the line he'd written months earlier. "They told us that freedom makes men weak." They were wrong. He underlined it, twice. Then he turned the page and began to write anew. "The strongest thing a man can do," he wrote, "is to admit he was wrong. And the strongest thing a nation can do is to learn." The words were simple, but they felt like prayer. Elsewhere in Germany, the reckoning deepened. The Nuremberg trials began that November. 22 men in the dock, the architects of destruction. The world listened as their crimes were read aloud. Wars of aggression, extermination, enslavement. The footage of the camps played before the court, and for the first time, the word Holocaust entered the language of history. In taverns and town halls, Germans watched the newsreels in silence. Some wept, some turned away. But no one could pretend anymore that they had not known something, however small. The truth had burned its way through denial, leaving only responsibility behind. Karl-Heinz saw the trial footage years later, when a traveling cinema screened it in Dresden. The faces of men he had once saluted appeared on the flickering screen. Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, now old, defeated, stripped of their grandeur. He felt no triumph, only sorrow. Not for them, but for what they had stolen. Not lives, not land, but innocence. By 1948, Germany was changing again. The rubble was clearing, new roofs rising. Markets reopened. Trains ran on time. Children played among the ruins, laughing where once there had been weeping. The first notes of recovery, tentative but real. And then, one spring morning, Karl-Heinz stood on the reconstructed bridge over the Elbe, watching barges drift beneath. The air smelled of coal and blossoms. The sound of hammers echoed in the distance. He realized that the noise reminded him of something, the hum of American factories he'd heard through Mississippi nights. But now, it was Germany's turn to rebuild, not as a machine of war, but as a maker of life. He thought of his mother, of what she would have said. She'd have told him that the world always breaks before it learns to bend. He smiled at that, for the first time without bitterness. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he walked through the city square. Streetlights flickered on, powered by generators that hummed like distant memory. He passed a bakery, its windows glowing warm with the smell of bread. Real bread, not rations. Inside, a young woman laughed, her hands dusted with flour. The sound stopped him in his tracks. It was the sound of normalcy, of survival, of beginning again. He thought of the men who hadn't made it, friends buried in the desert, comrades lost at sea. He thought of Thomas, the American foreman who had taught him to fix a sawmill belt and had never once called him enemy. He thought of freedom, not as a flag or slogan, but as the simple act of waking up without fear. And in that moment, under the flicker of post-war lights, Karl-Heinz understood what all the noise, the ruin, the years of captivity had been leading toward. Redemption wasn't victory, it was responsibility. In the decades that followed, the world would change again. The Iron Curtain would divide Germany in two, the Cold War rising from the ashes of the last one. But in both East and West, the memory of that transformation, of America's industrial power, of the reckoning it inspired, would linger like a heartbeat beneath history's skin. For men like Karl-Heinz, that heartbeat never faded. It was the sound of hammers and engines, of renewal, of proof that even after the darkest night, human beings could choose to build instead of destroy. And sometimes, when he lay awake in the quiet of his rebuilt home, he could still hear it, the faint, distant hum of that other continent, that restless giant that had once defeated him not by hatred, but by sheer humanity. It was the sound of a lesson that took a war to teach, and he knew then that no victory, no ideology, no empire could ever equal that, outside. The wind carried the smell of rain. He closed his notebook for the last time. Somewhere far away, a train passed in the distance, the same low, steady rhythm that had once echoed through America's heartland. He smiled. The sound no longer frightened him, because he finally understood what it meant. It was the sound of civilization refusing to die. The war had ended years ago, but its echoes never really stopped. They pulsed through the veins of the 20th century like the low, steady beat of a machine that refused to shut down. From the rubble of Europe, from the dust of battlefields and the silence of graves, a new world began to assemble itself, one rivet, one oath, one uneasy piece at a time. And at the heart of that reconstruction stood a paradox. The same America whose bombers had darkened Europe's skies was now lighting its cities again. For Karl-Heinz Wöhler, the years after his return unfolded like the slow lifting of fog. He found work first as a mechanic, then as an engineer, repairing rail cars that connected what was left of the German economy. The skills he had learned in Mississippi, how to read an engine's rhythm, how to think of efficiency not as haste but as harmony, served him well. Sometimes, while tightening a bolt or calibrating a gauge, he caught himself humming the same swing tunes he'd once heard leaking from an American radio aboard a Liberty ship. It embarrassed him at first. Later, it comforted him. He had survived the war, but now he was learning how to live after it. That, he discovered, was a much harder art. The world around him was transforming with impossible speed. In 1948, the Deutschmark was introduced, and with it came the first true breath of recovery. Factories reopened, power returned, and a miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, took root amid the ruins. Where once there had been ash, now there was industry again. Rebuilt railways, new refineries, humming assembly lines. Children who had grown up playing among the rubble began apprenticeships in the very trades that had once fed the war. But the tone was different. Gone was the feverish arrogance of conquest. In its place, quiet purpose. Germans built not to dominate, but to endure. For men like Karl-Heinz, that difference was everything. He no longer measured strength by the number of tanks a nation could forge, but by how many homes it could heat, how many bridges it could raise. He kept the old notebook tucked in a drawer, the one filled with lines from the camp days. Sometimes he read it to remind himself that the world could change if people chose to learn. Across the Atlantic, America entered its own metamorphosis. The wartime factories never truly slept. They simply changed dreams. Where once they had stamped out bomb casings, they now produced automobiles, televisions, refrigerators, luxuries that turned into symbols of peace. Highways unrolled across the continent like ribbons of steel. Suburbs blossomed from fields that had once been training grounds. The same industrial will that had crushed the Axis now built the middle class. The same workers who had riveted warships now assembled prosperity itself. And yet, beneath the gleam of chrome and neon, a question lingered. What should be done with all that power when there were no enemies left to defeat? America's answer was to build, everywhere. Schools, hospitals, libraries. And overseas, under the Marshall Plan, the same locomotives that had hauled ammunition now carried wheat and medicine to Europe's starving cities. It was as though the continent's conscience had shifted from destruction to construction overnight. In the ruins of Frankfurt and Hamburg, the first shipments arrived, boxes stamped with a white star and the words from the people of the United States of America. Children tore them open like Christmas presents, powdered milk, chocolate, books. Their parents wept. It was not just aid. It was atonement made tangible, proof that humanity, after tearing itself apart, still remembered how to reach across the divide. Karl-Heinz saw it firsthand. In 1950, he found himself working with an American firm contracted to rebuild a power plant outside Dresden. When the first American engineer arrived, a gray-haired man named Franklin Mason, Karl-Heinz recognized the accent instantly. Midwestern, warm, unhurried. They shook hands awkwardly, two former enemies now united by blueprints. Mason laughed. "Guess we're in the same business again," he said. Only this time the product's electricity, not artillery. They worked side by side for months, rebuilding turbines that had once supplied energy to munitions factories but would now light homes. One evening, as they watched the generators spin to life, Mason said quietly, "You know, it's funny. We thought we were the good guys. You thought you were. Maybe we were both just lucky to survive long enough to figure out how wrong we could be." Karl-Heinz nodded. "In the camps, I used to think power came from machines," he said. "Now I think it comes from forgiveness," Mason smiled. "Maybe they're the same thing when you use them, right?" Meanwhile, the memory of the POWs themselves became part of a larger story, a story that neither side had expected to write. In small towns across America, former guards and German prisoners began exchanging letters. Some visited years later as tourists, shaking hands over fences that no longer stood. American farmers who had once hired POW labor invited their former captives back for Thanksgiving dinners. Old photographs emerged, smiling Germans beside tractors, handwritten notes reading "No longer enemies." Historians would later marvel at how uniquely humane the American POW system had been. Not perfect. There were injustices and moments of cruelty, but compared to the chaos of Europe, it was astonishing. Out of 400,000 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 100 had died in captivity. The rest went home, fed, educated, changed. They carried stories about fair treatment, about decency, about the shock of seeing a free nation out-organize a dictatorship. And when those stories reached Germany, whispered from man to man in the long queues of ration lines, they became seeds. Seeds that would, in time, help the soil of a broken nation bear democracy again. In 1952, Karl-Heinz married a nurse named Elsa, who had survived the bombing of Leipzig. She had worked in field hospitals during the war and had seen the worst of humanity without losing her gentleness. Together they rebuilt a small house near the river, nothing grand, but sturdy. He built her a garden in the back, where tulips and sunflowers rose through soil still flecked with shrapnel. Each spring, the flowers came back stronger. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they sat by the wireless listening to American jazz drifting across the airwaves. The same music that had once symbolized the enemy now sounded like freedom itself, loose, improvisational, alive. He would close his eyes and remember those warm Mississippi nights, the lazy whir of crickets, the hum of the camp generator. And he would think, we lost the war, but maybe we found the future. History marched on. The Berlin airlift, the birth of NATO, the Cold War dividing the world in two. New ideologies rose, new fears, new competitions of industry and ideology, this time between East and West. But underneath it all ran the same current that had begun in the 1940s, belief that productivity itself could be moral, that machines could defend peace as well as wage war. America's factories had proved what was possible when a democracy organized itself without surrendering its soul. The lesson was not lost on Europe. In Germany, unions negotiated, not rioted. Companies like Volkswagen and Siemens rose from rubble, powered by a workforce that had once served under banners of conquest, but now built for cooperation. It was as though an entire generation had decided that the only acceptable victory was creation. Still, the memories never left entirely. Sometimes, walking through a train station rebuilt from the ruins, Karl-Heinz would catch the smell of diesel and iron and be transported back, to the desert, to the camps, to the endless trains of America's heartland. He would pause, hand on the cold steel railing, and listen to the hum of the engines. Not fear, not pride, just memory. It reminded him that progress and peril were twins, born of the same genius, that every factory was a promise that could be broken or kept. Years passed. His children grew up learning English in school, their textbooks filled with pictures of skyscrapers and highways. To them, America was not the enemy of their father's youth, but the ally of their future. They watched Western films, drank Coca-Cola, dreamed of traveling to New York or San Francisco. Karl-Heinz encouraged it. He wanted them to see the world that had changed him, not through propaganda, but through their own eyes. And one day they did. In 1961, when his eldest son won a scholarship to study engineering in Michigan, Karl-Heinz traveled with him to the airport. Standing on the tarmac, he felt the roar of the jet engines, the evolution of the same machines that had once carried war. He smiled as the plane lifted off, silver in the morning sun, heading west, the same direction his own ship had taken more than 2 decades earlier. The same journey, but for a different reason. He thought, so this is how history repairs itself, one generation at a time. By the 1970s, the world had changed again. Factories now hummed with computers. Satellites circled above. The Cold War cast long shadows, but for the first time in history, global annihilation coexisted with global communication. And beneath all of it was that same industrial heartbeat, louder, faster, digitized, still proving that human creativity could outlast human cruelty. Karl-Heinz grew old watching it happen. His hands stiffened, his hair turned silver, but his eyes never lost the engineer's gleam. He became a quiet chronicler of the century's transformation, jotting notes on scraps of paper. The machine has no morality. It takes its character from the men who build it. He kept a single photograph on his desk, a group of prisoners at Camp Shelby, standing beside an American foreman, all smiling beneath the sweltering sun. Beneath it, he had written, "Where the future began." When he finally returned to the United States, it was 1984, 40 years after D-Day. He came as a guest, part of a reconciliation program that brought former POWs back to visit the places they'd been held. The ship docked at New Orleans. From there, he took a bus north. Mississippi hadn't changed as much as he expected. The pines were still tall, the air still heavy with heat. But the camp was gone. Only the outlines remained, a faint grid of earth where barracks had stood, now overgrown with wildflowers. He walked through the fields slowly, hearing the echo of boots on gravel, the murmur of men long vanished. He knelt, picked up a small rusted nail, and turned it in his fingers. The metal was fragile now, flaking away, but it had outlasted the war that created it. A local farmer approached, curious. "You one of them old fellas from over there?" he asked with a smile. "Yes," Karl-Heinz said softly. "I was here once a long time ago." The man nodded. "Well, you're welcome back. Lot of stories in this soil." Karl-Heinz looked around at the wide sky, the endless horizon, and felt tears blur his vision. "Yes," he said. "There are." That evening he stayed in a small motel on the edge of town. From his window he could see the highway, alive with headlights streaming east and west. America still in motion, the great engine still turning. He thought of the men he had known, Thomas, the professor, the guards who had shared cigarettes and humanity in equal measure. He wondered if any of them were still alive. Then he realized it didn't matter. What mattered was that their kindness had survived, passed invisibly through time like a current in a wire. He opened his old notebook, brittle now with age, and wrote his final entry. "The war taught me what machines can do. Peace taught me what people can choose, and between the two lies, the only hope our species will ever have." He closed the book, placed it on the nightstand, and listened. Outside, a freight train moaned through the darkness, steel on steel, fading toward the horizon. That same ancient sound that had haunted his nights as a prisoner now soothed him. It was no longer the sound of war's logistics. It was the sound of continuity, of civilization persisting despite itself. The next morning, he visited a small museum in town. Inside, behind glass, was a display dedicated to the German POWs who had once worked the local mills. Photographs, letters, a pair of worn boots, a hand-carved wooden toy made by a prisoner for a farmer's child. The placard read simply, "Enemies in war, neighbors in peace." He stood before it for a long time, his reflection mingling with the artifacts. Somewhere behind him, a tour guide spoke softly to a group of school children about forgiveness, about learning, about how even wars can have teachers. He smiled. The future was listening. When he returned to Germany, he found it unrecognizable, prosperous, democratic, peaceful. The new generation spoke of Europe, not empire, of unity, not purity. Factories buzzed with innovation, not mobilization. The same efficiency that had once built tanks now built cars that circled the globe. And in offices and workshops everywhere, men and women worked not from fear, but from purpose. They had inherited the discipline of their ancestors and married it to the openness they had once feared. It was, in its quiet way, the fulfillment of every lesson learned in those American fields. Karl-Heinz Wöhler died in 1992. In a world where East and West Germany had finally reunited. In his workshop they found the old notebook, its last page marked by a single sentence in careful handwriting. "Strength is not what you build against others. It is what you build for them." His children donated the notebook to a museum in Dresden. It rests there still beneath glass, beside a photograph of American factory workers from 1943. Men and women whose labor had unknowingly changed the soul of the man who once called them enemy. Visitors often pause at that display, drawn by the simplicity of the message. Some linger longer, listening to the faint hum of the modern city beyond the museum walls, cars, trams, construction cranes, the everyday music of industry and peace intertwined. The same hum that once filled the skies of America and the dreams of a captive soldier. In the end, that is what the story of the German POWs reveals, that the truest power in war is not destruction, but demonstration, to show an enemy the strength of humanity through the efficiency of compassion. The prisoners who crossed the Atlantic expecting cruelty found order, fairness, abundance, and that, more than any weapon, dismantled their belief in tyranny. America's industrial might was not merely steel and smoke. It was principle forged into process. It was democracy made visible, organized, relentless, creative. And for those who witnessed it, it became a lifelong reminder that freedom, when disciplined by purpose, can outproduce any dictatorship of fear. Now the generations who lived that war are nearly gone. The camps are fields again. The factories hum for peace, but the echo endures, in every supply line that feeds rather than starves, in every alliance built on cooperation instead of conquest. It is the sound of humanity learning, painfully, to trust its own hands again. If you stand on a quiet night near any rail yard or factory, you can still hear it. That low, rhythmic pulse of engines, gears, motion, the heartbeat of a civilization that once nearly ended itself, and then, miraculously, chose not to. That is the true legacy of the German prisoners who saw America's power and understood its secret. The machines were loud. But what changed them was what they heard beneath the noise, the steady, indomitable rhythm of a free people at work. And that sound, that simple, human sound, was what finally conquered them.